In the upper Midwest, something that no one dares to discuss stalks the borders of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Deep footprints appear outside of children's windows, terrified family pets refuse to go outside after dark, and shadowy figures stalk bedrooms. And rumors of even stranger things, misty apparitions, disembodied growls, and something that no one can identify captured on camera. This episode tells one family's story of how they came to understand that something hides in the shadows of America's heartland. I'm Josh D'Anocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. At 1:30 on the morning of Thursday, July 17th, 2014, a woman named Susan was lying in a bed inside her home in Heartland, Wisconsin. But even though it was so late, she hadn't fallen asleep yet. Her small dog wasn't letting her. The pet was usually quiet through the night, but tonight it was behaving differently. From the moment Susan had gotten in bed, the dog seemed agitated. I mean, it wouldn't stop whimpering and yapping, and Susan was just so exhausted and desperate for some peace and quiet. So she quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her special needs child, who was sleeping in the next room, and she made her way to where the dog was standing by the back door. Now, the only thing that she could think of was that maybe it wanted to head outside to use the bathroom. But when Susan swung the door open, she noticed something odd. Her dog's body was rigid and its fur was standing on end, and Susan, thinking that maybe a deer had simply wandered into their yard, decided to take a quick look outside. So she grabbed her dog's leash, clipped it on, and quietly opened the door that led to the deck behind her house. She stepped outside with her dog, or she would have if her dog had followed her, but it didn't. Now it was cowering behind Susan's legs, and the dog was trembling, pressing itself against the back of Susan's calves, just trying to make itself as small as possible. And that's when Susan looked up and out into the backyard. That's when she saw it, standing in her yard, illuminated by the lights from her deck as well as others from around the neighborhood. There was this figure there, and it was on two legs, fully upright like any person would be, and appeared to be around 6 feet tall. Susan initially thought it was just somebody playing a trick on her, or that it was a person in a thick gray jacket. But then she realized that this intruder wasn't wearing a jacket, and in fact, it wasn't human at all. So as she peered through the darkness, she quickly came to realize that she was looking at a creature. It had gray fur over its entire body, though the fur appeared thickest on the creature's muscular chest, giving it that fluffy jacket-like impression. And its head was like that of an animal. It had short, pointed ears on top and a stubby snout. In fact, it reminded Susan of the snout of a boxer or another short-snouted dog. Either way, she realized that it was definitely not flat like a human's face. And even its arms, they hung at its sides, and they too seemed to be more muscular at the top, and they trailed down to the end in long paws. Each finger, though, displayed claws big enough to be noticeable even in the dim light from the neighboring houses and streetlights. And like the arms, the thighs were also muscular, but thinned considerably down toward the lower limbs. She knew that there was only one way to describe them. They were the legs of a canine. And now, she could only guess that the thing seemed to have come out from a small thicket at the back of another neighbor's yard. It was walking through a mulched area on the lot lines between her property and the neighbors behind her. And she could see that it didn't move flat-footed, but instead walked on its toe pads, just like a dog does. And she isn't sure exactly how long she watched this thing. All that she knows is that as she stood frozen on her deck, this thing suddenly swiveled its gray head around and looked directly at her. And even though there wasn't enough light hitting its face for her to make out its eyes or any glow that they threw back, she absolutely knew that it saw her. And folks, worst of all, it didn't react like a typical animal would. An animal would be scared, right? But this didn't scamper away or freeze. This thing realized that she was watching it, and in her own words, kept on walking on both legs like it didn't care. It was at that moment that Susan realized she might be in danger and decided that she'd seen enough. She reached down, snatched up her little dog, darted back inside her house, closing and locking the door behind her. And safe to say, she didn't sleep a wink the entire night. Well, the following morning rolls around, and Susan did something that most people in her situation probably wouldn't do. Instead of just trying to convince herself that she had imagined the whole thing, she picked up the phone and dialed the police. And she told them exactly what she had seen, knowing full well that they might think she's crazy. Even when she was speaking to them on the phone, she fully expected them to laugh at her or tell her that she must have been seeing things. I mean, this is Wisconsin. Maybe told her to lay off the booze for a few days too. But to her surprise, the officer on the phone didn't make fun of her. In fact, he informed her that he believed her, and he even advised her to exercise caution. So when she asked if there had been other reports like hers, the officer wouldn't answer her. And that only made Susan wonder if other people had seen something similar and that she wasn't crazy. Well, a few days later, on Sunday, July 20th, she noticed that her dog was acting weird again. And whenever it went near the rear patio door, her dog would just start whining and crying, and it got to the point where Susan had to start taking it out through the front yard instead. Now again, this wasn't normal behavior for her dog, and it really concerned Susan enough that she decided to reach out to someone who might be able to help her make sense of what was happening. So she went online and found a researcher by the name of Linda Godfrey. Now, Linda is an investigator who specializes in unusual animal sightings, particularly those involving canine-like creatures walking on two legs. She explained what she had seen in her backyard. A phone interview immediately followed the next day. Linda was actually thrilled that Susan had contacted her so quickly after the incident. And in these types of investigations, time is very important because evidence like footprints or even hair samples can be destroyed by rain, wind, or, even just yard maintenance. Linda, too, lived in Wisconsin, and Linda came out to her house on Tuesday, July 22nd. After talking with Susan and getting to know her better, Linda was very impressed by how straightforward she was and just how genuine she seemed in her experience. Susan was obviously determined to find out what that thing was in her yard, and in fact, she even made a sketch of what she had seen. The two women actually started examining the property, beginning with the deck where Susan had been standing on the night when she spotted this thing. They then moved to the back of the yard, in the general area where Susan had seen it walking. And that's when they found something significant. A number of deep impressions in the mulch and dirt, and they were right along the same path that this thing had taken just days earlier. And actually, there were two different kinds of tracks. Some were clearly just from deer, but the others were shaped like those of a dog and measured between 4.5 to 5 inches long. But what made these tracks especially interesting was how clear they were, despite being in mulch, which doesn't typically hold tracks very well, and having been there for around 5 days. Now, from what Linda could tell, these footprints seemed to have come from the hind feet of something walking on two legs, and, they followed this path leading from where Susan had seen it toward a small patch of adjacent trees. On average, the tracks were about 1 inch deep, which suggested they were made by something really heavy, heavier than either of them. In fact, when Linda and Susan tried to recreate similar impressions, by jumping up and down in the mulch, they couldn't even make any sort of dent at all. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when Susan and Linda realized that there were also similar prints in the mulch beds near the foundation of her house, actually underneath some of the windows. And one of those windows led to the bedroom of Susan's child, her special needs one. That's when she revealed something that she hadn't mentioned before. Almost nightly, her child had been crying for the past month about a monster peeking in through her bedroom window. But every time Susan got there, whatever it was had vanished. She'd always figured it was just her child's imagination until she saw the tracks under the window. Now she was definitely starting to have her doubts, and as Susan and Linda kept poking around, they noticed a couple of piles of animal droppings. One they found near the house, another pile was out in the backyard. So Linda took a look and figured they were way too small to have come from, the 6-foot-tall thing that Susan had seen. Even still, Linda was convinced that something odd was happening on her property. Now, Linda fully realized that the idea of a tall, wolf-like creature walking around a suburban neighborhood might sound a little out there for people. But she pointed out that Heartland might actually be a good spot for something like that to hide out. For starters, there's no shortage of water with Pewaukee Lake and 8 other small lakes nearby. Plus, the Kettle Moraine State Forest, which is a place with a long history of cryptid sightings, isn't that far to the north either. So when Linda asked if Susan had ever heard of similar sightings, she just said no, but she was 100% sure of what she'd seen. And folks, it wasn't a bear. And so Susan told Linda that the main reason she was speaking up at all was because she thought people ought to know. Linda asked Susan to stay in touch as she got ready to leave. But that was when Susan dropped something else that took things to a whole new level. You see, while she hadn't heard of any similar sightings nearby, this wasn't Susan's first strange experience on that property. In fact, about 3 years earlier, a massive white wolf-like animal had walked right up to her patio door and just stood there staring at the hot tub inside for several moments with this pair of unnatural, icy blue eyes. Susan had been inside at the time just a few feet from the glass and had gotten a really clear look. And this thing walked on all fours and looked like it stood about 3 feet tall at the shoulder. While it clearly wasn't the same thing she'd seen more recently, it still creeped her out. And she said that after a little while, the white wolf with the blue eyes had just turned and walked away calmly. And after Linda left, she decided to call the police again. And she asked if anyone else had phoned in recently with any more sightings. The officer she spoke to said no, but said that he'd tell the department to keep it in mind. With a little convincing, she got that same officer to admit that some of the night shift cops had mentioned something about an unknown animal in the area. That's all she learned, though. So in the meantime, Linda was checking the police logs in the newspaper to see if there'd been any more official mention of, some strange, unusual animal in the area. That night, July 22nd, after Linda had already left, Susan decided to be proactive. She pulled her motion sensor trail camera out of storage, mounted it on the deck's pergola, pointing it toward the backyard, and she made sure to put in fresh batteries. So when she went out and checked the camera the following morning, there was nothing. But it wasn't because the camera hadn't taken any pictures, it was because the new batteries had somehow died overnight. She realized how odd this was, but knew there was nothing to do other than replace them again. And this time, she just decided to just forget about the camera and leave it running for a couple of weeks. But only days later, she found something new that made her wonder if her intruder had actually returned. You see, on the siding of the house, just about 4 feet off the ground, there was a weird mark. It was like a single paw print made out of thin mud or silt, and it measured just over 4 inches, right around the size of the tracks she and Linda had found earlier. And in fact, it was in a really weird spot too. About 4 feet off the ground, too high up for a raccoon or her little dog, and nobody in the family had hands that size either. She took photos of both the print and the tracks and emailed them to Linda, who decided it was time for another trip to Heartland. So she came back on Friday, July 25th, to measure and document everything and see if she can find any fur or other signs on the trees nearby. She also asked Susan if she and her husband would be up for doing a nighttime stakeout next time activity picked up, and so they agreed. They didn't have to wait very long though, because on Sunday, August 10th, Susan emailed Linda with another update. Just a few days earlier, she'd taken out her dog on the deck in the early morning. Like before, it was around 1:30, and also, she had seen a large figure in the backyard, but this time, it was standing under the neighbor's big maple tree. She didn't want to wake her husband, and she understandably didn't want to go out into the yard by herself to investigate, but it didn't feel safe indoors. That was because, on top of the, monster peering through the window, Susan now said that her child had started talking about a ghost in her bedroom. I mean, she hadn't seen anything herself, but she knew better than to shrug it off after what happened last time. Things went quiet for a couple of weeks, but then on this night of Sunday, August 31st, Susan stepped outside with the dog again. And at this point, she'd given up on heading out to the deck, and this time chose a different door, the one leading to the patio. It was between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, and the night was calm and still, and she wasn't outside long before she heard this loud cracking sound. It was like a tree branch snapping, but it was coming from the neighbor's yard. And in the calm stillness of the night, it was so loud it was like a gunshot. And keep in mind, there was no wind, so there was no reason for this branch to just break on its own. And she's terrified at this point. She froze, and her heart is beginning to beat so loud that it feels like it's going to beat out of her chest. She rushed the dog back inside, slamming the patio door shut, and now her hands are shaking so badly she could barely pull the curtains closed. She starts to get pale, she could feel the blood draining out of her face, and for just that moment, she has the worst thoughts running through her mind. She just stood there frozen in her living room, trying to calm herself and do some deep breathing exercises and just convincing herself she was simply overreacting. Immediately, she hears something else, something closer to the house. It sounded like someone walking around on her patio. Whoever was out there, she could tell that the footsteps were not only deliberate, but slow, and they were moving from one end to the other, almost as if whoever it was casing the house or looking for a weak entry point. And these weren't the light scurrying sounds of a small animal, let me tell you. They were heavy and purposeful. And at this point, she feels like she's going to pass out. That's how much blood is leaving her face. Something inside of her told her that whatever was out there was the same thing that she had been seeing over the past 6 weeks or 2 months, just on the other side of the curtains. So she backed away from the door and ran to go get her husband. But when he finally woke up, she was frantically whispering to him that somebody was out there on the patio and that he needed to do something now. He was kind of like blowing her off, and, he mumbled a few words and simply headed out of the bedroom, thinking that she was completely overreacting. A minute later, she hears him sliding the door to the patio open, and Susan listened. At this point, her heart is nearly in her throat. She's doing everything she can to keep it together, and she could hear her husband walking around, checking the yard, just completely not believing a word that his wife had said to him. And after several moments, which was probably only maybe 3 or 4 minutes, he comes back inside. He's acting like it's no big deal, and he just tells her, "Look, Susan, there's nobody out there. I looked over the entire yard. You're losing it. I even looked over the fences. I looked behind every bush and tree. Honey, let's face it, there's nothing. You're cracking up." But that explanation wasn't good enough for her, because she knew, she suspected that whoever or whatever was out there was actually hiding and had been watching her husband as he searched the property. Come to find out, the next day, Susan, of course, remembered the trail camera. It should have caught whatever was out there on the patio, but once again, the batteries were somehow dead. And Susan was just at a complete loss. Just was it normal for new batteries to die that quick? But still, she replaced them anyway and hoped that they would last longer this time. I'll fast forward to the following evening. Both Susan's child and the dog were up most of the night, restless, and they felt agitated for no real apparent reason. On the morning of Tuesday, September 2nd, Susan checked the camera first thing, and surprisingly, this time it actually captured something. She actually had to kind of double take, for a moment or two to realize what she was looking at. And in the first 2 photos, which were snapped just several seconds apart, showed a bright light from the neighbor's patio on the left, and on the right, this thick, translucent column of mist. It was only a few feet from the deck, and in both photos showed a denser shape in the center of the mist that looked, kind of like a figure. Linda Godfrey said that both she and Susan thought it almost looked like a vague combination of a human being and an animal. The third photo was taken around 7 hours after the first 2. Even though it was still dark outside, the camera's date and time weren't properly set, so they couldn't tell exactly when. But what made this image so strange was that it was mostly obscured by these translucent, round, purple shapes that both reflect and absorb the camera's flash. The only clue that it was even taken in her backyard was because you could see the neighbor's patio light, and it was in the exact same spot as before, although now the haze was just a tiny glimmer. Linda was pretty stumped on this one, because it looked like whatever was in the frame was actually much closer to the camera than in the previous shots, and while it looked sort of organic to her, it didn't resemble any part of an insect, bird, or animal that she knew. And keep in mind that for this whole time, the camera had not been moved, it had not been messed with at all, and it was still securely fastened to the deck's support post. Unfortunately, even after hours of scouring online for an answer, the only real explanation that they could find was that the camera had captured lens flares from the neighbor's patio light, but it wasn't good enough, because that didn't explain the twisting shape inside the mist, and the purple globes, well, they just weren't sure. So Linda, taking things a step further, actually reached out to a dedicated photo analysis website. They floated a few other ideas. Maybe the strange shapes were insects caught in the flash, someone's breath fogging the lens, or maybe some kind of unusual ground mist that just happened to stick around long enough for 2 shots. However, as far as what triggered the motion sensor, they had no clue. Linda knew that in order to get to the bottom of this, they were going to have to take that whole overnight stakeout much more seriously. Linda began by scouting the neighborhood by car and on foot, just trying to figure out how much cover a large creature might have if it really wanted to move around without being seen. And to her surprise, there were plenty of wooded pockets. I mean, there was even a possible route out toward US Highway 16, which led right back to more rural areas. Susan's deck turned out to be the perfect vantage point as well. With cameras, flashlights, and an audio recorder ready, she and Linda set up for a night of watching and waiting. And so when it was time, the night was warm, it was clear, there was no rain. I mean, this was perfect, ideal conditions. Unfortunately, the only animals that had wandered into view were a scruffy-looking raccoon and a small coyote nosing around some trash. Even though Linda Godfrey went home empty-handed that night, she was not about to give up. Throughout the fall and winter, it seemed like the strange activity had finally died down, but the strangest was yet to come. One night, in early January of 2015, Susan suddenly heard her child screaming from the kitchen. This was a scream of pure terror, and in response, she looked up and found her child rushing to her, visibly shaking with fear. The only thing the kid could say was, "Make it go away, make it go away," which they just kept repeating over and over and continuously pointed in the direction of the kitchen. Susan, who's now terrified as well, followed her child's finger and saw that she was pointing in the direction of the door that led to the back deck. However, Susan couldn't see anything unusual, but she also knew not to take her child's warnings for granted. In an effort to console her terrified child, she learned that there was supposedly a dark figure standing right by the back deck door in the kitchen. And not really knowing what else to do, she kind of just, looked toward the spot in the kitchen where her child was pointing and firmly told this thing that whatever it was, it needed to leave the house right now, and it was not welcome there. And right after she said that, Susan felt this sudden change in the atmosphere. It was like this heaviness that she hadn't realized was even there had suddenly lifted. Her child immediately calmed down. When Susan asked if the dark figure was gone, her child had nodded yes. A few nights later, Susan was in her house when she noticed that the family dog had started acting really strange again. It was running back and forth, acting almost like it was playing with someone, except there was nobody there. So she called to her dog, and it just continued to ignore her and do its weird behavior. And so finally, she stepped closer to see if she could figure out what's going on. And when she stepped into the living room, which was now dark, it suddenly stopped running around. But it wasn't facing Susan, it was actually facing the wall. And now it was barking aggressively at the wall as if it was reacting to someone or something that Susan couldn't see. Almost instantly, she just feels this wave of unadulterated evil wash over her, and the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and her entire body reacts to this presence that's she all of a sudden feels is here. She quickly turns on all the lights and checks around the house, but of course there's nothing. But the feeling didn't go away, and she just kept feeling that something wasn't right, and that feeling never left. In fact, the house felt more evil and oppressive than it ever had, but she was forced to live with it for the time being. Now, over the next couple of weeks, all throughout January, she began noticing other strange things happening in her house. I mean, for instance, she would remember opening her bedroom door only to find it closed when she saw it the next time. And, She thought maybe she was closing it by accident or, maybe that it was off center, but she had never noticed anything like that before. And neither her husband nor her child ever admitted to messing with it. There was one evening where her child swore that she had been woken up by a sudden flash of bright light that burst from the closet, like a camera flash. But of course, when Susan looked, there was nothing inside that could have possibly caused it. Now, there were no toys or electronics or light fixtures. It was impossible. There's just clothes and stuff. During this time, in broad daylight, Susan was filming her dog playing with a toy in the living room, and later, when she was rewatching the video, she noticed this weird growling noise in the background that she hadn't heard when she was recording it. She assumed it was just her dog, but as she kept watching it carefully and listening more, it was obvious that her dog wasn't making the noise at all. Completely freaked out by this, she actually shared it with Linda, and, after watching it, Linda agreed that the growl didn't come from her dog, that something else in the background was growling. And when you add all this strange stuff that had been going on for the last 6 months, there was something happening. Unfortunately, it just continued to intensify. And there would be times, when Susan would be at home alone and she would hear these distinct knocking sounds coming from different areas of the house. Sometimes it was like it was actually inside the walls, but other times it sounded like somebody was knocking on a door or a window from outside. And even though she checked thoroughly inside and outside, there was never a single trace of somebody being there. Additionally, she had also heard footsteps echoing throughout the house at random times of the day. Again, nobody was there. At this point, she was understandably desperate for just any kind of explanation or solution. Even though she wasn't religious, she began saying protective prayers all around her home. And, she would go to each window and door and say the prayer and begin asking for protection and for whatever was in her home to leave. Now, to her surprise, after she started doing this, things did begin to calm down. And even after a short amount of time, her dog seemed to return to its normal behavior. Unfortunately, it isn't clear from Linda Godfrey's report if Susan finally banished whatever was on her property or if it simply went somewhere else. In early February, Susan got a call from her contact at the local police department, and the officer explained to her that another woman who just happened to live a block away from her had reported something very strange. This neighbor had discovered large, unusual animal tracks crossing her yard and circling her house. And of course, the tracks didn't match any known wildlife, and they seemed to have just appeared overnight. Susan was, of course, terrified, and she realized that whatever had been stalking her home was now onto this person's house. Since early 2015, things at Susan's house have remained relatively quiet. She's kept up the trail cameras, she's added more lights to the patio, and while she's still gotten a few odd images, none have really clearly revealed what might be lurking around her property. But what happened to her and her family isn't an isolated event. It is just one instance in a growing number of reports stretching across rural and suburban America. The evidence that Linda Godfrey uncovered, from strange tracks to these odd photographs, suggests something far more disturbing than just an animal, that there was a presence on the property, something far beyond what we think we understand. Because you guys have made it to the end of this episode, I want to know what you think, so leave a comment. If nothing else, I want you to comment down below, make it go away, so I know which ones of you made it to the end and who didn't. And, you should totally slap that like and subscribe button too, so you can watch more content just like this. Never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.